Hello, and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Sarah, and I'm a bookseller at Politics and Prose, where we host a range of in-store events along with classes and trips. Before we get started tonight, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phone so as not to disrupt the event. When we get to the Q&A portion of tonight's event, please line up at the microphone next to the podium to ask your questions. Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Carrie Lowry Schuettpelz, celebrating the release of the book The Indian Card: Who Gets to Be Native in America. Schuettpelz is an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. She spent 7 years working in the Obama administration on issues of homelessness and Native policy. She holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a master in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. The Indian Card is her first book. She will be in conversation with Molly O'Toole, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author who most recently worked as the immigration and security reporter for the Los Angeles Times in Washington, D.C. She is currently working on a nonfiction book about migration from around the world, and this book is set to publish in 2025. So please join me in welcoming tonight's guests.
Got like a quasi hometown crowd here.
I know, it's pretty awesome. First things first, everybody say cheese. Awesome, thank you. Hello, everybody. I've just realized that I left my book in the back, so hold, please.
Do you want this one, or do you want your
because
own
I
copy?
have it marked where I'm.
Everyone hold on. She's got it marked. Has to be the special copy. Hi, everybody. This was totally the plan that I was going to be up here by myself for a minute. Hi. Here we go.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. This is really a dream for me. I lived in DC for a long time and came to a lot of events here. So it's fun to be here, and I'm just really appreciative of everybody for coming. So the book is a weaving together of a lot of different things. So I'm going to read you two of those things. The book includes a little bit of memoir, a little bit of interview, a little bit of historical research, and a little bit of data. So I'm going to try to give you a sense of all of that with a couple of sections. 12 hours after I had birthed my daughter via cesarean section, my husband gently informed me that we needed to complete her paperwork. The paperwork would be used to process her birth certificate and social security card, documents that carry so much weight that they absolutely should not be presented to a woman who's just had her internal organs ripped out of her body and then shoved back in. I knew that this kind of paperwork would live on in the historical record for time immemorial. It was, after all, in the initial stages of writing this book that I used birth records and US Census records to create my own family tree going back generations. I've always found it strange to capture my identity in small boxes. The problem being that forms, whether surveys or rolls, don't allow for any nuance. Just as there are never enough tiny squares for all the letters of my last name, there's rarely room for complexity in counting. The conundrum my husband had, one that I had too, was whether to check the Indian box on my daughter's forms. My daughter was born in Iowa and will likely be raised there. She'll probably struggle to navigate the same distance I always did, the one between her home and that other home, the home of our tribe. In some ways, I imagine the distance will be greater for her. She will never get to meet my grandfather or my great uncle or my cousins Arthur and Calvin, or the other relatives who have since passed away. The Lumbee elders who I credit with guiding me on my own journey of identity formation will, for her, exist only in stories. If we take stock in blood quantum, which I'm pretty sure I don't, my daughter's will be even smaller than mine. Her ancestry a more diverse array of geographies and family lore from both mine and my husband's sides. I will, of course, try to pass along the origin story and traditions of our tribe. I'll try to nurture the connections between my daughter and her larger Lumbee tree. But in the end, only time will tell whether her native identity will be salient for her. From my hospital bed, I asked my husband what we had written for our son, born 2 years earlier. Neither of us could remember, my excuse being hospital-administered narcotics, my husband's being his height. We always joke that at 6'10", the thinner air he breathes up there makes him more absent-minded. Our son was born in April 2020, a few months into the COVID pandemic. It was a time when panic seeped its way into everything. Our groceries, our mail, our clothing, the air we breathed. I had terrible depression after my son was born, perhaps as a result of postpartum hormones, perhaps as a result of the terrifying new global reality, perhaps a bit of both. In any event, my memories from that time have become one of those splotch tests that psychologists administer. I see something different every time I look. In some ways, not remembering what I've written for my son's forms feels like a privilege. As someone who considers herself biracial, but who presents mostly as white, I am privileged in the sense that I can choose what boxes to check on forms. I can choose what not to check, too. I can do the same for my children. For my daughter's paperwork, I was relieved to learn that we could check more than one box. We marked both the white Caucasian box and one called American Indian Alaska Native, giving our daughter a laundry list of identities that I suppose she can one day learn to navigate herself. But until that time, until she and my son are old enough to make the decisions for themselves, I must navigate those identities for them. It was this way when, in 2023, I traveled back to North Carolina to visit my family and renew my tribal enrollment once again. After 3 years of near constant surges, COVID had receded enough for me to feel comfortable traveling with my small children. It would be the first time they'd set foot in Pembroke, the first time any of my extended family would have a chance to meet them, and it would be the first time that grappling with questions of Native enrollment and identity, of membership, of belonging, would feel so fraught. Because in the summer of 2023, on our trip to Lumbee country, I'd be faced with the decision of whether to enroll my children in the Lumbee tribe. And now I'm going to give you a little taste of history. Although there isn't one common Native American origin story, historians seem to agree that before the arrival of European settlers, most tribes relied on oral traditions as opposed to written ones. In many tribes, stories were told by designated storytellers. They conveyed myths and ritual and history. They shaped identity and helped give meaning to people's lives. Oral traditions would also have included family histories, what we today might call genealogy. By listening carefully and committing these stories to memory, generations of families would have carried forward the legacy of those who came before. When I asked Dan Littlefield, whose work on the history of the Cherokee Nation has earned him a place in the Oklahoma Historians Hall of Fame, if he knows of any historical efforts by tribes to write down their records, he's somewhat stumped. According to Dan, most historians seem to agree that before contact with white settlers, the only written records tribes made took the form of pictographs, or images symbolizing ideas. Whether painted on rocks or beaded into elaborate belts, these pictographs would have represented events or cultural practices important to the tribe. Dan tells me that in his own research, he has not found any lists of a tribe's members until the early 19th century, and even those were made by federal officials. What I take from conversations with historians like Dan is that, in large part, before contact with settlers, Native tribes would have not considered it important to record membership on paper. There wouldn't have been much of a need to maintain written records of who belonged. Rather, particularly in tribes using kinship as their guiding system of governance, they'd rely on leaders of bands or rancherias or heads of families to keep everyone together. Written records of membership and enrollment, it seems, were a product of colonialization. Mostly, they would have been made by the settlers themselves. In other words, the colonization of this land, of this country, would have also included the colonialization of the historical record. According to Dan, even in the case of the Cherokee people, whose tribes have some of the longest histories of written record keeping, it wasn't until they experienced removal pressure from the federal government that their members began making census records. Dan Littlefield is not Native himself. He is quick to point this out. It is important to him that people know that, especially since it's not a fact matched by the written historical record. When Dan was born in May 1939, doctors were responsible for completing a newborn's birth certificate. This included answering the question of color or race. Because Dan, the child of farmers Daniel and Irene Littlefield, was born on Route 1 in Salina, Oklahoma, deep in Indian country and with a head full of black hair, the doctor assumed he was Native American. So on his birth certificate, despite not having a trace of Native ancestry, Dan Littlefield is recorded as Cherokee.
Wow. Okay. What a start. As we all process that, yeah. Round of applause definitely required there. As we sort of process that and start to sit with that, just a quick note to say too how honored I am to be here with you, and obviously in this great space where so many amazing authors and important books have come before us, and so I will do my best to be up to the moderating task here. And ever since we met, I think maybe a year or so ago, I've been so excited for this book. So it is such a delight to be here with you and to sort of have it in my lap. Also just as proof that it's possible.
I know.
A book can be finished. Here it is. We're surrounded by the by the living proof, which I have yet to achieve myself. But also, yeah, to welcome you back home to a place, at least for a time, that you called home. And envious too, as a wannabe author, of the way that you managed to weave all those things, as you said, in this book. Somehow a book that is equal parts hilarious, very funny, but also sort of rage-inducing when you look and examine, as you do, the historical record, but also somehow hope-inducing, somehow inspirational. But maybe on the rage-inducing aspect, I'd be remiss sitting here a week after a very important event that occurred and welcome you back to DC. I have to ask you, you lived here for a time. You were part of the Obama administration. We sit here now a week after the election. How does it feel to sort of observe these events in Washington from the home you have made now in Iowa? Like, what is the feel of that? What does that feel like? What can you bring from places like Iowa to here? And then what from your time sort of within the Beltway have you brought back to the home that you've made in Iowa?
Oh, that's a lot of pressure. I think it's a lot easier to. So I live in Iowa now, and very, very, very far outside the Beltway. And I think that it's easier to disassociate ourselves, or at least I have found it easier to dissociate myself from the politics just of the world, but particularly the politics happening in DC. Not to say that that's the right answer, the right thing to do, but it's easier to do that, I think, when you don't live inside of the bubble here. I think I'm still processing, so it's just, I'm not sure. I didn't know what it was going to be like coming back. I mean, I've been thinking about this since long before the election. What was it going to be like to come back a week after an election, or 2 weeks after an election? And I don't know. I think that it's probably going to feel different as the weeks go on. But
we talked a little bit about just how much identity politics, but how much identity was a part of this election. And I'm not going to platform some of the horrific things that were said and the way that, in particular, the vice president's identity was put under a microscope. And I'm wondering what that sort of evoked in you, given how the central role that identity plays in this book.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know Kamala Harris, but I felt a lot of empathy for everything that was coming at her in the way of identity. It reminded me a lot of this book. It reminded me a lot of this idea of, when are you enough of something to claim it? And so, especially growing up 1,000 miles away from my own tribe, the Lumbee tribe, I grew up in Iowa. Always sort of feeling like maybe I wasn't Native enough. I wasn't Native enough to claim it. I wasn't Native enough to have my card. Just sort of having that feeling. And I remember some of the sort of rhetoric I was reading about and hearing about Vice President Harris's identity. Well, is she Black or is she Indian? Is she Indian enough? Is she Black enough? And it felt very similar. And I think it really, I knew that this wasn't a Native alone thing. I knew that this idea of identities being complicated was certainly not unique to Native communities. But I think that was a moment for me where I realized, wow, there are a lot of people grappling with these issues.
And one of the things for me, as a wannabe author, I was really interested in the way that you handled language in the book, not just sort of your personal grappling with identity and the history of U.S. policy in terms of grappling with a national myth around a kind of national identity, but the way that you really tackled that head on. But how did you think about using language on one level, sort of using language as a vehicle or strategy to examine the ways in which terminology has been a huge part of the way that the U.S. government in its policy has sought to sort of other, divide, control, and even erase Native identity?
Yeah, I mean, I never want people who feel interested or compelled to think about these issues and talk about these issues and certainly advocate for these issues. I don't ever want them to feel like they can't engage because they're scared of the words to use. And so I thought it was important for me in the book to tackle that idea of like, well, can I say the word tribe? Can I say the word Indian? Can I say the word? Because that's sort of how I experience it. I hear that from my students a lot. I teach a Native public policy class at my university. And so I try to approach it from a place of acceptance, like here's how I think about these issues. It doesn't mean that what I think is the only right answer. But as an example, I think a lot of people get hung up on this idea of Native nations as opposed to Native tribes. And I get a little bit irritated when people are very quick to say, well, no, it's always nation. It's always a Native nation. I mean, a lot of Native communities call themselves a tribe. If you look online and look, so my first point of reference is always to figure out what the people are calling themselves. And so if you were to go to the website of a Native tribe or nation and see that they called themselves a Native tribe or nation, that would be the best bet, is to use that kind of language. So that's the sort of busting the barriers that I was attempting to do, was explain how I think about those things in the event that it was helpful to other people too.
I'm also thinking of terminology like blood quantum, which I think has to be one of the most bone-chilling terms that I've ever encountered. And it makes me think of one of the quotes that one of these like amazing gems that you managed to dig up from very recent history, actually, 1951. It was an Interior Secretary talking about a head of the BIA saying that they were Hitler and Mussolini rolled into one. Like blood quantum seems like a term that would like be the fever dream of a Hitler and a Mussolini rolled into one. And then another line that really stuck out to me, even though you were quoting a fictional character from a TV show, is the U.S. government only quantifies 3 things by blood: dogs, horses, and Indians. So there was a level in which language in that way, the sort of blunt bureaucracy of language and the way you tackled that was really incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the blood quantum thing is it's confusing and complicated and something I don't think anyone has an answer to. But what was interesting to me was digging through historical records to figure out where did it come from? Where were the first instances of it being used formally? I found this like very obscure manual that no one knows where it came from. So essentially, this actually was really funny to me, and I think he would agree it's funny. So I was trying to figure out where this thing called the Certificate of Degree of Indian Blood came from. It's called the CDIB, and it's used to complete a lot of paperwork for Native people. I think it's been decoupled from some federal benefits, but at one point that's what you would have to complete. And I was trying to figure out where this thing came from. And the more and more people I talked to, the more and more people would say, well, you got to talk to Paul. And I was like, who is Paul?
There's always a guy.
There's just a Paul. And they're like, oh, Paul's the expert on. So there's a guy here in the US who actually is the lead counsel for the Navajo Nation, and he's the CDIB expert. And so I called Paul, very nice guy, and I was like, where the heck did this thing come from? And he's like, I don't know. No one knows. I'm the expert and I don't know. And that really, I think, was a moment where I was sort of, it almost gave me permission to explore. I mean, I think there's like a certain level of anxiety when you're talking about or tackling issues that have been widely written about or thought or just have, hundreds of years of history. I think I came to it a little bit intimidated because I was like, well, I'm not the first to think about this stuff, and I'm sure there are other people who have already thought these thoughts. But it was a little bit comforting to talk to Paul and be like, I don't know, I think it gave me permission to explore things. What I found was one of the first sort of official and formal federal documents outlining how to quantify the blood quantum. It read like a recipe card. It was like this giant 32 by 32 chart with, one parent's blood quantum at top and one on the side, and then you would find yours. And so it would be like mix 1/4 Native person together with 1/32, and voila, you get that. I mean, it just was very weird to me. And so I think that quote, even though it came from a show no one's ever seen before called Longmire, it is available on Netflix. That quote, the federal government only measures 3 things by blood: dogs, horses, and Indians. I mean, it's true. It is a true statement. And so the more that I found those sorts of things, the more I kind of realized that there is a place for us to have conversations about this, particularly citizens of individual tribes who feel like they want to have a conversation about what are we using? Are we using blood quantum? Why? Could we be using something different?
I want to get into that, the why, and the fact that it is still being used, that this is a present tense. But one thing I wanted to briefly touch on is that I feel like you also gave the reader permission to not just have the conversation, but also to laugh. You're very funny. Obviously, everyone who knows Carrie knows that she's funny. But I just thought the way that your personality really emerged through this book, which tackles such difficult material. I mean, it's a lived experience, obviously. So part of the way I want to ask this is, how the fuck did you get fucked so many times into this book? Sorry, excuse the language. I noted the children in the audience before.
So it's actually funny. I have an incredible team at Flatiron, and my editor, Lee, I remember right when we were first getting to know each other, she really had only seen my proposal. Like she didn't know what this was going to look like, nor did I. And I remember saying to her, like, I just need you to know that I'm going to say fuck a lot. Like, I just need you to tell me it's okay. I need you to tell me that you're willing to accept a manuscript. Because that's how I was thinking when I would come across things like this. It's like, what? Why is this the thing we're using to base enrollment and membership and identity? But I also think, I tried really hard in this book to portray Native people as, like living and breathing humans. I think a lot of times Native issues, Native people, Native cultures are presented in a way that feels very antiquated and historical. And it's hard to relate to. And what people don't often see, although there has been sort of a really rich Native literature sort of boom lately, which has been really exciting to see. But I think what we don't see enough of is like Native people living in the world. And so I think it's important to know, like, some of us say fuck, some of us like think we're funny. Some of us, you know, like do things just like everybody else in terms of the modern world. And so that became a really important communication and sort of like voice that I needed to allow myself to have.
Midwestern foul mouth is how you referred to it.
Well,
and you
I
saw
referred
it in Karen.
to a friend, yeah, my friend Karen Diver, who some of you know, that she's a Midwestern foul mouth, and she often gave me permission to be that same way.
That's probably the phrase I should have used rather than quoting directly from the language given the audience. Note to self for next time. So on that was a lighter note, I suppose, but on a heavier one, one of the questions that toward the end of the book, and especially in the epilogue, you sort of referenced this. But one of the questions that I felt I had coming away from this book is one of the sort of urgent, unanswered questions that I wanted to put to you tonight is why? I mean, why do tribes and nations, some of them, continue to use, in terms of deciding who gets to be native, continue to use some of the terminology or processes that were devised by the US government with the intention of actually erasing Native identity? Why? What are some of the challenges there, and is there a different way forward?
So I can only pontificate. I mean, there are over 500 federally recognized tribes across the United States, and they're all different. And I know sort of the historical record keeping that I've seen. I can also say, because as part of this book project, I created a data set that, to my knowledge, is the first of its kind, where I organized all of the federally recognized tribes according to their enrollment criteria. And so, does the tribe use blood quantum? If so, in what degree? What is the date of their most recent constitution, if they have one? I mean, just for me as a data nerd, I needed to be able to sort of step back from the trees and see the forest, and that was my way of doing that. And in doing that, what I came to learn, and although I don't have every single tribe's information because it wasn't always possible to find, but certainly for the tribes that exist in the contiguous US, so in the lower 48, more tribes use blood quantum than don't. And so if we're thinking about, essentially there are two ways that tribes determine membership and enrollment. One is blood quantum, which is a mathematical quote unquote mathematical calculation of how much blood you have from that tribe. The other main way would be more of a lineage-based system, which is you must connect yourself to a direct ancestor on a given role. And so if the tribe says, oh, we're using the 1898 Dawes rolls as our main role, you must go connect yourself to someone from that role. So that's kind of the two main ways that tribes do it. The fact that so many were using blood quantum was somewhat of an epiphany to me. I didn't realize it was that many. And so I was curious what the thought behind that was. I mean, I think like blood quantum has come under a lot of scrutiny, especially by Native people, and it feels like the kind of thing that is not particularly serving tribes well if we think about sustainability. In fact, just recently, within the last year, a tribe up in Minnesota hired a private consulting firm, the Wilder Group, which is a really prestigious research group, to tell them what would happen if they continued to use blood quantum. So this was a tribe that uses a quarter. You need a quarter blood from that tribe. And what Wilder sort of came back to them and said is, if you continue to do this, in 100 years, you will be extinct. So it's not just a matter of, is this serving us or not? It's actually a matter of survival. And so I worry about blood quantum in terms from that vantage point. The way that I sort of have pontificated it in the book in terms of, well, why are we still using this? I would guess, first of all, anyone who has ever been a part of a bureaucracy knows that it's hard to change rules. It's hard to change policies. It can be extremely expensive and time consuming. You may not have the resources to do it. So I think there's a very pragmatic kind of reason, but also I suppose tribes might be using it to proxy connection. So with the thought that a person whose blood quantum is higher may be more connected to the tribe. Maybe if your blood quantum is a tiny, tiny fraction, you don't have family still in the tribe. You don't know anything in terms of the historical, cultural roots of the tribe. Maybe you have never been to their community. I guess that could be a reason. I don't know for certain. But what I do know is that just like we residents and citizens of the US have the right to question what our government does, so too do citizens and members of tribes and nations. And so I really think it's up to each tribe and nation to have this conversation with their members and say, is this serving us well?
On that note, I'm really curious about the reception that you've received, especially from either the tribes or nations in terms of sort of themselves or other Native people. I mean, what kind of reception have you gotten? This is a difficult conversation to have, but also a really unique book. I'm wondering what the reception has been.
I mean, I have heard from a lot of Native people that they've had very similar experiences as the ones portrayed in the book. Right from the beginning of writing this book, I knew I wanted to interview people. I knew I wasn't just going to have my own story. My story is somewhat unique in the sense that my tribe is not fully federally recognized. I've started saying it that way
Can you maybe just, not to interrupt the flow of the answer to this question, but can you maybe explain that a little bit more?
So the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, which is my tribe, they have an act from 1956 called the Lumbee Act, which recognizes us as being Native, but it doesn't recognize us as receiving any benefits. What you have to remember about that time period, to just provide some historical context, is that a lot of tribes were being terminated in that era. In fact, that era was called the termination era and of federal Indian policy. And so the federal government was trying to get tribes off their books. They wanted to not spend as much money as they were. They wanted to not be responsible from a resource standpoint. And so over 100 tribes were terminated. They lost their federal recognition. That was the context of the time frame when the Lumbee Act was written. So perhaps not surprisingly, the federal government said, yes, fine, you're Native, but we're not giving you anything because we actually are trying to get tribes off of our books. The problem is that in all of these years since then, never have we been given our federal recognition back. Meanwhile, the tribes that have been terminated have been given their recognition back. And so it's put us in this situation of sort of being, sort of qualifying for things and sort of not.
There's so many examples of that in the book, of this sort of limbo or sort of catch-22 that the policies have created. And
speaking of not feeling Native enough, I mean, that has also added to this idea, certainly for me. But I knew that story was going to be somewhat unique. There are other tribes that are not federally recognized that should be. But I wanted to make sure that I was portraying sort of a broader constellation of stories than my own. Now, 10 stories certainly are not representative of the entire universe, but I did start to see patterns of how we thought about connection, identity, home, belonging, all of the enrollment, all of these things. And so what's been really great about hearing people, either come up to me at readings or write into my website or, however they find me, what's been really great is I have been hearing from a lot of women about the fact that finally they saw their story in something. They finally felt like, okay, someone else has experienced this. I'm not alone. And to me, that feels really, really fulfilling. In terms of hearing from Native nations or tribes, I mean, I've heard from my own and they like it because I'm telling people that we should be federally recognized.
We exist.
But I think I think that what's been more important to me, frankly, has just been the individual people who have told me that it meant something to them.
And then I just want to take a moment before we get to questions to ask what's next. I mean, this grappling with identity is sort of the project of your life on a personal level, but also, I mean, you're an educator, you've been a public policy maker, you're an incredible researcher. I loved the scenes from you digging in the National Archives, but that was the geek in me coming out. You know, a writer, an author. You know, what comes next for this project?
So one of the stories that really inspired me in the book was my friend Karen Diver, who was President Obama's senior advisor on Native policy.
The Midwestern foul-mouthed.
The Midwestern foul-mouthed variety. So she, you know, I had known all along I wanted to interview her because she has such an interesting story. And she also was the chairwoman of her tribe, the first woman to serve in that role. So she offered a lot of insight into some of the things I was thinking about. What I didn't expect was that she would talk a lot about her uncle and her father in her interview. Her father has passed away. Her uncle is still alive. So this is a man who's 85 years old. He lives in Cleveland, which is, you know, hundreds of miles away from their tribe in Minnesota, and has sort of experienced all of the federal Indian policies that have happened over the last 85 years. He was stolen to boarding school at age 5. He went into the military when he graduated high school. He was relocated to Cleveland as part of the Indian Relocation Act, and he's remained there ever since. He doesn't feel a strong connection to his tribe because he's unfortunately experienced all of these federal policies that have taken him further and further away for a reason, right? That's what they were trying to do. But one of the things that he talked a lot about was having been stolen to boarding school at age 5 and having grown up at this place that was hugely traumatic for him, very abusive, hundreds of miles away from his home, and this sense of resentment that he felt because no one in his family saved him. No one came to get him. He wondered why no one had, you know, driven out to the boarding school to bring him home. And so, and he sort of offhandedly said to me, you know, I've never seen a picture of myself before I was 18. And I don't know, you hear that and you're like, well, I know how to, I have a researcher card with the National Archives. And so I started trying to find his records. I didn't even know if they would, I didn't frankly know anything about Indian boarding school records until this point. What I now know is that children who were stolen and sent to boarding school, many of them have records inside the National Archives. What I actually know is that over 200,000 of them have records inside the National Archives because I now have the spreadsheet. I believe it to be the only one in existence. And so to go back to Don's story for a moment, what we found was we found his files from the 2 boarding schools that he had attended, and one of them included handwritten letters from his mother and his sister begging officials to send him home. This man is 85. He's never seen these documents at all. His mother and sister have both passed away. He can't have that conversation with them. It doesn't change what happened, but it has brought him a little bit of closure. And I think seeing that process sort of made me realize, like, we could do more. We could do something about this. And so one of the projects I've been working on with my Native Policy Lab, which I have at the University of Iowa, is record return. So we're trying to return as many records as possible to living survivors, their families, and their tribes. So right now I'm working with the Chickasaw Nation to return all 2,500 records back to them. These records do not belong in the National Archives, by the way. They don't belong there. They belong to the survivors, their families, and their tribes. So that was sort of an eye-opening moment. The other thing that became pretty clear to me as someone who thinks a lot about data, but also thinks a lot about like policy making based on the data, was I became fascinated with this idea of land, of native land, of the problems from the perspective of these federal Indian policies over the years, what these policies have done in terms of making land really difficult to own, really difficult to acquire, to consolidate. And these are all continuing to have impacts on tribes and nations in terms of their ability to monetize the land, to build things on the land. And so, so my next book, I think I'm allowed to say that, is going to sort of focus on this idea of land and thinking about what did the over 350 treaties signed between the federal government and Native nations, what did they say, what did they actually do, and how much money was actually paid for this land? Just sort of in an attempt to figure out what can be done moving forward in terms of equity and justice for land.
Wow. Okay. So that sounds amazing, and we'll all be back here for the next book launch. I think we're going to take some questions now. I believe that if you can come to the microphone, great. If not, we will figure out a way to get the microphone to you. Oh boy. Okay, here we go. First question from
Hello.
happens to be my husband.
It might not be.
Hi.
It might not be on. You might need to.
Do I need to?
It's supposed
Oh, is it on? Okay.
Is this on?
Oh,
Okay.
yes. Okay.
Also, happy birthday.
It's your birthday?
Yes, it's my birthday. Oh, that's
Molly's
embarrassing.
birthday. Anyway, moving on. Forgive me for this because this is kind of a sprawling question. It's really like 9 questions or trying to like formulate into one. It strikes me as you're talking about all of this that we envision ourselves, sometimes it's true at the best, as like a nation of like immigrants and a melting pot. There's kind of like broadly 2 categories of people that does not count for, which is enslaved people and Native Americans. And everybody else basically who ended up in this country came here willingly, and part of that is to like give up where they came from. Now, with the idea that those 2 groups of people, like there is something to preserve about like heritage and everything like that, that they sort of were forced to give up, which was not their own idea. Thinking about that with the idea of like the 2 ways to quantify First Nation status or Native status, which is being either blood quantum or heritage, both of them sort of have a pitfall to it in that there's like an erasure there, if I can use the right term, in different ways. Either like you're getting more diffuse or you're narrowing the amount of people. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if there's like a different way you've thought about of like trying to preserve those cultures that like this country has essentially tried to erase through like all of the things you've talked about today. And that looking long term, like you said, like there's a problem with each of those like inclusion methods, right? But there's still something that's going to be lost either way. Is there like some way to retain some of that culture or history or heritage or something like that that you can think of that's outside of, I don't know, who's included in a role or not and included in a nation?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're somewhat different in terms of thinking about enrollment and membership and thinking about historical and cultural preservation. I don't and never have believed that the only Native people are those enrolled. I just don't believe that. And so, you know, I think that they necessarily have to be different and separate. But the challenge is that, you know, this idea of enrollment and membership, which you're absolutely right, it shrinks rather than expands. It was a federal project. I mean, the goal was to shrink, right? And so one of the reasons why I thought a lot about land as I wrote this book is because enrollment was a product of land. It was a product of the federal government coming in and taking land that was held by tribes, carving it up into allotments, and then saying, all right, everyone who's part of this tribe, come forward. We will either say, yes, you do deserve, or no, you don't, and we'll give you your plot of land. That wasn't a great system, as you might imagine. A lot of people were left out. A lot of people were put in that shouldn't have been put in. But unfortunately, this happened 140 years ago. And so now what tribes are having to grapple with is, how do you think about a system that was created all that time ago, but is sort of all we've got in terms of a historical role? And now we've had decade upon decade of building off of it, you know? At the same time, I will say there are some incredible examples of cultural and historical preservation that tribes have done. I mean, I was just at the Chickasaw National Library a couple weeks ago, and I think tribes are really thinking in terms of like innovation and how do we preserve not just like physical artifacts, but also records and our own knowledge. There have been a lot of language revitalization programs that have happened over the last many years, particularly for those native languages that are really at the verge of extinction. So I think that stuff is absolutely happening separate and apart from this idea of identity and membership.
Anybody else? Here we go. The brave souls making the journey to the microphone.
Hi. So I would just love to hear you talk a little bit more. I know what a wonderful writer you are and always have been, but I'd really love to hear you talk about your process of writing a book, and particularly a book not of fiction or storytelling necessarily, of your own personal creation in your head, but sort of an accounting as well as adding your own story to it. So
I was worried someone was going to ask me this question.
you knew it was going to be me.
Writers
And I
love
knew it was gonna be
process
Carlin, yeah.
questions.
I was trained as a fiction writer. I did my MFA in creative writing, and I think that was helpful, even though I ended up writing nonfiction. I think my process was that I didn't have a process, and that's what terrified my agent and my editor. I remember saying to my agent, have you ever had a writer who's actively doing research as they're writing? And she said, no. I said, oh, okay, well, and so I think that what this book required was that I be able to take a journey and write about the journey. And so, because that is my preferred sort of storytelling itself. I'm not a trained historian. I don't think of myself that way. And so part of it was me learning even how to research, learning how to use these resources like the National Archives, learning what exists in those places. And so I think I sort of did it as it came, you know, like I wrote it as that process was happening. I tried to stick to a timeline in terms of telling the story in order of when it occurred. And so telling the federal policy story through the 6 phases of federal Indian policy. And so that helped me a little bit in terms of navigating structure. I was thinking about it in that way. But process-wise, you just have to write. I mean, that's like what you learn, right? In like writing school is you just have to write, and a lot of what you write won't make it anywhere. But the process of just sitting down and doing it is really, really critical to the journey of coming up with a completed product.
And it's very generous in a way, the way that you let the reader in on your process of discovery. Mm-hmm. And as readers, we get to follow along with you as you are combing through these records. And I also really loved the sort of parallelism of the way you opened the book and the way that the book closed in terms of a literal homecoming. So those narrative techniques that you used, I thought were really, really powerful.
I remember I was I had some big questions, and I knew those were the questions that were going to drive the through line of the book. And one of the big questions was like, where did this idea of counting people come from? And you know, I certainly knew about the census. I knew that it had a long history, but I also knew that there was a much, much longer history of counting people. And I will never forget texting my editor and saying, you're never going to guess what I'm writing about right now. To which she sort of was like, uh-huh. And I was like, I'm writing about the 13th century Mongolian Empire. And she was just like, I trust you. I trust that that's going to be relevant in some way. But it was just, I think part of it is the freedom to just be like, today I'm going to read and learn about the 13th century Mongolian Empire. And making those connections sort of as you go was really important to me. So I don't think I have a process necessarily, but.
And then your editor learned to be terrified of receiving text messages from you.
Yeah, she still answers, so that's good.
Hello. Hello. Are you going to be publishing an audiobook?
Besides the one that they already have?
Oh,
Yeah, there is an audiobook.
wonderful.
Yes. It's not me reading it, but there is an audiobook. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. Because my daughter-in-law's family has been unsuccessful in trying to trace back their heritage, which they believe is with the Crete and Muskogee nation, and I'm hoping that you might give them some hope or some clues on how to do the research. Would that be the case?
I mean, I definitely did some research. I did research on my own family tree only in as much as we didn't have the documents. We knew the tree, we knew, roughly who was in it and part of it. But what was kind of interesting was seeing the literal ink on paper part of things. I hear this a lot from folks who are interested in doing sort of the genealogy about their own tree. And whether it's because of family lore, they've been told that they're native, they've been told that they're connected to a particular tribe. And I think that that's really interesting and something absolutely that people should pursue. I think the point at which I would invite them to think a little bit more about what they are trying to do is the point at which they connect that to enrollment, right? And so I think they're somewhat separate. This idea of I want to go into ancestry.com or whatever people use for genealogy. I want to go and figure out who my distant ancestors were. I think that has to be separated from a conversation of I would like to enroll in a tribe. So I think, both are.
Yeah, I agree. I think the documentation has been unavailable because of fires at courthouses or whatever, and that's where they got stymied. And I didn't know if some of what you ran up against or was able to report in your book could give them an additional lead.
Yeah, possibly. It's possible. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I think that's one of the things that your book also underscores is the sort of insidiousness in a way of who holds those records, who gets to have historical and genealogical records. I mean, the fact that the National Archives has the records for boarding schools, but that the survivors and the families aren't the holders of those records, I think really it says it all, right?
Yeah, I think I would love to see a conversation had about, particularly as it relates to Native records. After all, federally recognized tribes are sovereign nations, and they have a sort of nation-to-nation relationship with the United States in a lot of ways. And yet, all of these records that, in my opinion, should belong to us and should belong to the tribes are instead being housed inside of these federal facilities. And so I'd love to see a conversation that happens about who should rightfully own those documents. Yeah. Any last questions? Oh, there's one coming.
Okay.
Have you encountered resistance to these records being returned? And do you have any advice for those of us who would like to help you in this?
I have not encountered resistance. I mean, my ongoing sort of message is if survivors don't want to see their records, that is absolutely their decision and their right. The way records work is if anyone traces the census like I do, there comes a point at which records become public. It's a decades rule. And so there are some boarding school records that are a matter of public record. And so those, in my opinion, naturally would revert back to the tribe. But the youngest Indian boarding school survivors this year are 60. So we're not talking about, a small amount of people who are still alive and have had this experience. We're actually talking about tens of thousands of people. I would imagine, just based on the conversations I've had, that most people don't know these records exist. They don't know that there's a record with their name on it inside some federal facility. And so part of it has just been spreading awareness that these exist. Getting the records is hard. It requires understanding how the bureaucracy works, and that's where I've tried to help, be helpful to people. And with this pilot project that I'm working on with the Chickasaw Nation, we're learning a lot about how you take mass amounts of records, scan them, return them, find them. We're learning a lot with the hope that we can sort of take it to scale, because I feel a great sense of urgency about this. People like Don, he's 85. You talk to him about this stuff and you hear his story and you can't help but walk away thinking, like, we got to do everything right now. I feel a lot of urgency about it. So that's sort of the landscape of that. Frankly, I've received zero resistance from the National Archives, and that's been wonderful. I think they understand that this is really important and that these survivors deserve to see their own records.
How can there be a reckoning with the dark and traumatic legacy of boarding schools if the survivors and the families themselves don't even have access to the records or know that they exist? Right. So hopefully a lot of people read this book, hear about this book, so it can be part of this reckoning and part of this healing. But thank you everyone so much for coming tonight.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you to Carrie.